I was just the eccentric old woman living in the guest cottage. That's what my son-in-law Mark told his friends while sipping my expensive scotch. He thought I was losing my grip on reality. He didn't know that my confusion was a carefully crafted performance. He wanted my estate. Well, honey, the only thing he's inheriting is a jumpsuit and a federal indictment. Hello, darlings. It's Mary. Welcome back to the fire. You know, they say that as we get older, our hearing starts to go. We find ourselves asking people to repeat things or turning the TV volume up just a little bit higher. But let me tell you something about selective hearing. Sometimes we hear exactly what we aren't supposed to hear. Sometimes silence is the loudest warning we ever get. And sometimes the most dangerous thing in your house isn't a burglar or a gas leak. It's the man sitting at your dining room table, smiling and eating your roast beef, while calculating exactly how much that table is worth. Today's story is about a woman named Margaret, a retired forensic accountant, who spent 40 years catching white-collar criminals who thought they were smarter than the system. She thought she had retired from the game of cat and mouse. But when she bought a simple baby monitor for her expecting daughter, she discovered that the biggest rat she'd ever encountered was living under her own roof. So, pour yourself something strong, honey, because this one is going to make your blood boil. My name is Margaret, and for the last 6 months, I have been living in what my son-in-law Mark calls the guest cottage, and what I call the in-law exile. Don't get me wrong, it's a beautiful space. When my husband Arthur passed away 3 years ago, he left me with a portfolio that could rival a small European nation's GDP. But he also left me with a house that felt too big and too quiet. So when my daughter Lila announced she was pregnant with my first grandchild, it seemed like the perfect solution. I would sell the big house, buy a sprawling estate with a detached guest house for myself, and give the main property to Lila and Mark. I wanted to be close enough to help with the baby, but far enough away that I wouldn't be the mother-in-law who hovered. I paid cash for the property, put the deed in a trust that allowed them to live there, and settled into my smaller, quieter life. Or so I thought. Mark is 34 years old, works in high-end real estate, and has the kind of smile that looks fantastic in an Instagram photo, but never quite reaches his eyes in real life. He calls me Max, a nickname I detest, and treats me with the indulgent patience one might reserve for a toddler or a very slow pet. "You okay there, Max?" he'd ask, if I took a moment too long to find a word. "Need me to handle that bill for you?" He was always offering to handle things. My finances, my car maintenance, my appointments. He framed it as kindness, but after 40 years of auditing corporate fraud, I knew the difference between support and control. Support empowers you. Control isolates you. But for Lila's sake, sweet, trusting Lila, who looked at Mark like he hung the moon, I played nice. I bit my tongue when he bought a Porsche he couldn't afford. I smiled when he redecorated the main house with furniture that cost more than my first car. I told myself I was just being a cynical old woman. The turning point came on a rainy Tuesday in November. I had been out shopping for the nursery. Lila was 8 months pregnant and nesting with a vengeance, so I wanted to surprise her with a top-of-the-line baby monitor. I picked out the Angel Care 5000 or whatever it was called, a sleek device with high-definition video, and audio crisp enough to hear a pin drop. When I got back to the estate, Lila was out at a prenatal yoga class, but Mark's car was in the driveway. I decided to set the monitor up in the nursery myself to save Lila the trouble. I walked into the main house, letting myself in with my key. The house was quiet, save for the sound of rain against the windows. I went upstairs to the nursery, plugged in the camera unit near the crib, and then walked back out to my cottage, with the parent unit, the receiver, in my hand. I wanted to test the range. I wanted to see if the signal would reach all the way to my kitchen, just in case I was babysitting one night. I walked into my cottage, set the receiver on my marble island, and turned it on. The screen flickered to life, showing the empty crib in high definition. The audio kicked in with a burst of static, then settled into a low hum. It was working perfectly. I was about to turn it off when I heard the door to the nursery open. On the screen, I saw Mark walk into the room. He wasn't alone. He was on his cell phone, pacing back and forth in front of the crib. I reached for the power button, not wanting to eavesdrop on a private conversation, but then I heard my name. Not Margaret. Not even Max. He said, "The old bat." My hand froze. I left the device on. I turned the volume up. Mark was pacing, running a hand through his perfectly gelled hair. "No, Gary, you aren't listening to me," he said, his voice dripping with agitation. "I can't liquidate the assets yet. The trust is ironclad. As long as she's mentally competent, she holds the purse strings. I'm living in a $3 million mansion like a squatter." I stood in my kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter, so hard my knuckles turned white. Gary. That would be Gary Saunders, Mark's frat brother and questionable financial advisor. I'd met him once at a barbecue. He wore loafers without socks and smelled like desperation and expensive cologne. Mark continued, pausing to look out the nursery window. Looking, I realized with a chill, directly toward my cottage. "Yeah, well, that's the plan, isn't it? We're laying the groundwork. I've been gaslighting her for months, man. Little things. Moving her keys. Rescheduling her appointments and telling her she forgot. Telling Lila that her mom is getting confused, mixing up names. Lila is eating it up. She's worried sick. She thinks her mom is in the early stages of dementia." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. My breath caught in my throat. The misplaced keys last week. The dentist appointment I could have sworn was on Tuesday, but Mark insisted was Monday, the time he told me I'd left the stove on, when I knew I hadn't cooked that day. It wasn't my memory. It wasn't aging. It was him. He was methodically, intentionally trying to make me believe I was losing my mind. And worse, he was convincing my daughter of the same thing. "I need that power of attorney, Gary," Mark said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss that the high-tech microphone picked up perfectly. "Once I have medical POA and financial POA, I can declare her incompetent. We put her in a nice facility. I found one upstate, real quiet. And then I have control of the estate. I can pay off the Vegas debt before those guys break my legs. But I need a big event. Something public. Something that proves she's gone senile." He laughed, a cruel, sharp sound. "Don't worry. Her 66th birthday party is next week. I'm planning a little surprise. By the time she blows out the candles, everyone in this town will think she belongs in the loony bin." I stared at the small screen. Mark was smiling now, leaning over the crib, where my future grandchild would sleep. He looked like a proud father, but I knew the truth. He was a predator. A wolf who had invited himself into the henhouse and was now complaining that the hens were taking too long to die. He had debt. Vegas debt. And he was planning to use my life, my freedom, and my sanity to pay for his mistakes. He was going to lock me away in a facility and steal the legacy Arthur and I had built for Lila. My first instinct was to scream. I wanted to storm across the lawn, burst into that nursery, and claw his eyes out. I wanted to call Lila and tell her everything. I wanted to call the police. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. But then a strange calm washed over me. It was the same cold, sharp clarity I used to feel when I found the discrepancy in a ledger, the one loose thread that would unravel a multimillion-dollar embezzlement scheme. Screaming wouldn't help. If I confronted him now, he'd deny it. He'd say I was hallucinating, which would only prove his point that I was senile. He'd say I misunderstood. He'd charm Lila, and she, in her delicate state, might believe him over me. No, anger was a luxury I couldn't afford. I reached out and pressed the record button. On the side of the parent unit, I watched the little red light blink, capturing every word of his plan. Yeah, the offshore account is the key, Mark was saying. If I can just get her to sign the transfer, thinking it's a donation to charity. Easy money. I let him talk. I let him dig his own grave, shovelful by shovelful. I listened for 10 more minutes until he finally left the room. Then I saved the recording, popped the SD card out of the device, and walked to my wall safe. Hidden behind a painting of a storm-tossed ship, I locked the evidence away. Then I went to my liquor cabinet, poured myself a glass of Arthur's favorite scotch, and sat in my wingback chair. My hands stopped shaking. My tears dried up. Mark wanted a confused old woman. Fine. I would give him the performance of a lifetime. I would be the most confused, befuddled, helpless little old lady he had ever seen. I would lead him right to the edge of the cliff, and when he leaned over to push me, I'd step aside and watch him fall. You know, honey, there is a special kind of exhaustion that comes from pretending to be less than you are. We spend our whole lives trying to be smarter, sharper, and quicker than the world expects us to be. We fight to be taken seriously in boardrooms, in car dealerships, and at the dinner table. So to voluntarily surrender that dignity, to intentionally act like the confused old biddy that society already wants to write you off as, well, that takes a stomach of steel. Margaret had a stomach of steel. She had spent 40 years staring down embezzlers and tax cheats without blinking, but staring into the face of her own daughter and lying to her. That was the hardest thing she had ever done. The next morning, I initiated phase 1 of what I called Operation Gaslight. I walked into the main house kitchen at 8 a.m. sharp. The sun was streaming through the bay windows, illuminating the granite countertops that Mark had insisted on installing, despite the perfectly good quartz that was there before. Lila was sitting at the island nursing a cup of herbal tea and looking tired. Her pregnancy ankles were swollen, and she had that faraway look of a woman who hasn't slept through the night in 3 months. Mark was there too, scrolling through his phone and aggressively buttering a piece of toast. He didn't look up when I entered. "Good morning, Arthur," I said cheerfully, directing the greeting at Mark. The silence in the room was instant and heavy. Mark stopped buttering his toast. Lila turned to me, her eyes wide with alarm. "Mom," Lila asked gently. "That's Mark. Dad passed away 3 years ago. Remember?" I blinked, feigning a moment of foggy confusion. I looked at Mark, then at Lila, then down at my hands. Oh, of course. Silly me. I don't know why I said that. He was sitting in Arthur's chair, that's all. I saw Mark smirk. It was a quick, fleeting thing like a lizard flicking its tongue. But I saw it. He exchanged a look with Lila, a look that said, "See, I told you she's getting worse." "It's okay, Mags," Mark said, his voice dripping with that fake, syrupy patience. "We all have those moments. Why don't you sit down? I'll get you some coffee." "Thank you, dear," I said. I sat down and watched him pour the coffee. When he set the mug in front of me, I stared at it blankly for a moment. Then, with a confident smile, I picked up the salt shaker from the center of the table and proceeded to dump a generous teaspoon of salt into my black coffee. I stirred it vigorously and took a big sip, forcing myself not to gag. "Mom," Lila cried out, reaching for my hand. "That's salt. You just put salt in your coffee." I looked at the mug, then at the shaker, playing the part of the bewildered grandmother to perfection. Did I? Oh dear. I thought it was the sugar. My eyes aren't what they used to be. Mark was practically vibrating with excitement. He was witnessing his plan in action. He thought his gaslighting was working so well that I was doing the work for him. He patted Lila's shoulder. "It's okay, babe. Don't make a big deal out of it. Mags just got a little mixed up. Why don't I drive you to your doctor's appointment today, Mags? We wouldn't want you getting lost on the way to the clinic." I let him drive me. I let him treat me like a fragile piece of antique china that was about to shatter. But the moment he dropped me off at the medical center and drove away, the fog cleared from my eyes. I didn't have a doctor's appointment. I had called the receptionist, Mary Ann, whom I had known for 20 years, and asked her to cover for me. Instead of going to see Dr. Henderson, I walked out the back exit of the clinic, pulled a baseball cap low over my silver hair, and hailed a cab. I gave the driver an address in the industrial district, a place where the coffee was cheap, the tables were sticky, and the clientele didn't ask questions. I was meeting Frank Vance. Frank was a private investigator I had used back in my corporate auditing days. He was rough around the edges, smoked cigars that smelled like burning tires, and had an ex-wife in every time zone, but he was the best researcher I had ever met. If information existed, Frank could find it. I slid into the booth opposite him. He was already nursing a black coffee and looking at a manila folder with the kind of grim expression that usually meant bad news. "Margaret," Frank rumbled, his voice like gravel in a blender. "You look too good to be meeting me in a dump like this. You tell anyone I'm drinking decaf, I'll deny it." "Good to see you too, Frank," I said, ignoring the pleasantries. "What do you have on my son-in-law?" Frank opened the folder and slid a stack of papers across the cracked laminate table. "It's worse than you thought, Margaret. Your boy Mark isn't just a bad gambler. He's a catastrophic 1-inch. I pulled his credit reports, his bank statements, and some records that technically shouldn't be accessible without a warrant. He owes $450,000 to a shell company registered in the Caymans. $450,000, I whispered. The number made me nauseous. "That's the principal," Frank said. "The interest is compounding daily. The guys behind this shell company, they aren't banks. They're part of the Slavic syndicate operating out of Atlantic City. They break thumbs first, Margaret. Then they start burning down assets. Mark has been paying them just enough to keep the wolves at the door, but he's tapped out. He's got 3 mortgages on that house you bought them, disguised as renovation loans." My blood ran cold. He mortgaged the house. The house that's supposed to be Lila's security. "He forged your signature as a guarantor," Frank said flatly. "It wasn't hard. He's been practicing. I found tracing paper in his office trash. But here's the kicker. He's not just stealing to pay debts. He's trying to build a golden parachute. I found a one-way ticket to Brazil, booked for 3 weeks from now. Brazil." The pieces clicked into place. The birthday party. The rush to declare me incompetent. Mark wasn't planning to stick around and manage my estate. He was planning to get power of attorney, liquidate everything he could touch, dump Lila and the baby, and disappear to a country with no extradition treaty. He was going to leave my daughter bankrupt, single, and homeless with a newborn. I felt a surge of rage so pure it almost blinded me, but I pushed it down. Rage is fuel, but you have to burn it slowly, or you'll explode. "What about the business?" I asked. "His real estate firm." "Smoke and mirrors," Frank said. "He hasn't sold a property in 6 months. He's using the firm's accounts to wash the money. He's skimming from your accounts. I found transfers labeled marketing expenses that go straight to offshore sports betting sites. The guy is sloppy, Margaret. He's desperate. And desperate men are dangerous. I looked at the photo Frank had clipped to the file. It was a surveillance shot of Mark, arguing with a large man in a parking lot. Mark looked terrified. Good. I need everything, Frank, I said, tucking the folder into my oversized tote bag. I need the forgery proof. I need the bank trails. I need the names of the loan sharks. I can get it, Frank said. But Margaret, be careful. If he figures out you're onto him. He won't, I said, standing up and adjusting my baseball cap. As far as Mark knows, I'm currently trying to remember if I'm wearing pants. I took a cab back to the clinic, just in time for Mark to pick me up. When I got into his car, I made sure to look disoriented. I asked him if we were going to the park. He patted my hand and smiled that shark-like smile. No, Mags, we're going home, he said. By the way, I've been thinking about your birthday next week. We're going to throw you a big party. Invite all your old friends. The whole town. It'll be a night to remember. I looked out the window to hide the glint in my eye. Oh, Mark, I thought. You have no idea. It certainly will be. They say you can't trap a fox with just any old bait. A fox is clever, suspicious, and always looking over its shoulder. To catch a fox, you have to offer it something it wants so desperately that its hunger overrides its instinct. You have to offer it a way out of the cold. Mark was a fox with his leg caught in a trap of his own making, that $450,000 debt to the Slavic syndicate, and he was chewing his own leg off trying to escape. All I had to do was show him an open door. But here's the thing about open doors. In a story like this, honey, usually there's a sheer drop on the other side. The days leading up to my birthday party were a masterclass in tension. The house felt like a bomb with a faulty timer. Mark was becoming increasingly erratic. I'd hear him pacing the hallways at 3 a.m., arguing in hushed, frantic tones on his burner phone. Lila was a nervous wreck, trying to mediate between her failing mother and her stressed-out husband, blaming herself for the atmosphere in the house. It broke my heart to see her so distressed, wringing her hands and trying to make everyone herbal tea, but I had to stay the course. If I broke character now, Mark would win. And if Mark won, Lila lost everything. I decided to spring the trap on Thursday evening, 2 days before the party. I knew Lila was out at her prenatal yoga class, a routine I had encouraged her to stick to, which left Mark and me alone in the house. I set the stage in Arthur's old study, a room lined with mahogany bookshelves and smelling of leather and lemon polish. I sat at the massive oak desk, a single lamp illuminating a pool of yellow light in the darkening room. In front of me, I placed the blue ledger. Now, the blue ledger was a prop. I had spent the previous night forging it, using old accounting paper I'd saved from the 90s to ensure the ink looked properly aged. Inside, I had detailed a fabrication so tantalizing it would make a forensic accountant weep. A secret unreported account in the Cayman Islands, containing $2 million in liquid cash. I waited until I heard Mark's footsteps in the hall. He was walking heavily, the gait of a man carrying the weight of the world. As he passed the open study door, I started muttering, 7, 4. No, that's not right. Arthur said it was the birthday. Which birthday? I mumbled, shuffling the papers frantically. The Cayman transfer. It has to be done by Friday. Mark stopped dead in the hallway. I didn't look up. I kept my head bent over the ledger, my hands trembling slightly. Max? Mark asked, stepping into the room. His voice was sharp, alert. What are you doing in here? It's late. I looked up, blinking rapidly, peering at him through my reading glasses. I let my face soften into a look of relieved recognition. Oh, Arthur. Thank goodness you're here. I'm having such trouble with the codes. The account manager in Georgetown. He said we have to authorize the transfer before the audit on Monday, or we lose the tax shelter. Mark froze. He took a step closer, his eyes locked on the blue ledger. Arthur. Mags, Arthur is. Arthur isn't here. It's Mark. I waved a hand dismissively. Don't be silly. I need your signature, Arthur. The $2 million. If we don't move it to the shell company, the IRS will find it. We can't let them take half. Not after you worked so hard. I saw the change in his face instantly. The exhaustion vanished, replaced by a predatory focus. But then he paused. He didn't lunge for it immediately. He narrowed his eyes. The first sign of intelligence I'd seen in weeks. $2 million. Mark said slowly, walking around the desk. Mags, I've seen the estate portfolio. I went through every file in this office. There is no Cayman account. My heart skipped a beat. He had actually done his homework. I had to pivot, and fast. I clutched the ledger tighter to my chest, lowering my voice to a conspiratorial whisper. Of course you didn't find it in the files. You silly man. You told me never to write it down. You said the lawyers were leaks. Remember? You said, Margaret, this is our rainy day fund. Even the kids don't know. I watched him process this. I was banking on his own criminal nature. A man like Mark assumes everyone else is cheating the system too. If I told him Arthur was honest, he'd be suspicious. But telling him Arthur was hiding money from lawyers, that he believed. A slow smile spread across Mark's face. He knelt beside my chair. Right, he said, his voice dripping with greed. The rainy day fund. The one the lawyers don't know about. Smart. Very smart. But the audit is Monday. I fretted, tapping the page. And I can't find the key fob. The key fob? Mark asked. The digital key. I whispered. For the transfer. You put it in the safe. Mark stood up, practically vibrating. He looked at the painting of the ship on the wall. The safe, he muttered. Do you have the combination, Mags? I forgot it. Oh, Arthur, I chided gently. It's Lila's birthday. It's always Lila's birthday. Mark walked over to the painting and swung it aside to reveal the wall safe. He punched in the numbers, 0412, and the heavy door clicked open. Inside, I had placed a single silver USB drive. It looked like a high-tech security key. In reality, it contained a keylogger program that, once plugged into a computer, would record every keystroke, password, and website visited. It also contained a dummy banking interface I had hired a coder to build. A fake website that looked exactly like a Swiss bank portal. Mark grabbed the USB drive. He turned back to me, clutching it like a holy relic. I'm going to handle this transfer for us, Mags. I'm going to make sure the money is safe from the audit. You're a good man, Arthur, I said, smiling vaguely at the bookshelf. Always taking care of us. Yeah, Mark said, already backing out of the room, his eyes wild. I'll take care of everything. He practically ran out of the room. I listened to his footsteps pounding up the stairs to his office. I heard his door slam shut. I sat in the silence of the study for a long moment. The trap was sprung. Mark was upstairs right now, plugging that drive into his laptop. He would access the fake banking site. He would try to transfer the funds to his own offshore account. And in doing so, he would create a digital paper trail of attempted grand larceny and wire fraud, so clear that a first-year law student could convict him. But that wasn't enough. I didn't just want him arrested. I wanted him exposed. I wanted the world to see him for what he was. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the rain-soaked garden. The birthday party was on Saturday. Mark had invited everyone. Lila's friends, our neighbors, his flashy business associates, and even my old bridge club. He planned to use the event to publicly demonstrate my incompetence. Happy birthday to me, I whispered to the reflection in the glass. Saturday arrived with the kind of crisp, clear weather that makes wealthy people feel justified in their good fortune. The house was transformed. Caterers in black vests buzzed around, setting up carving stations and champagne towers. A string quartet was tuning up in the foyer. It was obscene. Mark was spending money he didn't have to impress people he didn't like, all to celebrate the birthday of a woman he was planning to commit to an asylum. I spent the morning in my cottage, resting. Lila came by at noon to help me dress. She looked exhausted, dark circles bruised under her eyes, but she forced a smile. Mark got you a beautiful dress, Mom, she said, holding up a navy blue silk number. He really wants tonight to be special. He's a thoughtful boy, I said, allowing her to help me with the zipper. Lila, honey, are you happy? Lila froze, her hands on my shoulders. She looked at me in the mirror, and for a second I saw the cracks in her denial. Of course I'm happy, Mom. We have the baby coming and the house. It's just stressful right now. Mark is under a lot of pressure at work. Pressure makes people do strange things, I said softly. He loves us, Mom, she said, though it sounded more like a question than a statement. He's just worried about you. He thinks you might need more help than we can give you here. There it was. The seed he had planted was blooming. We'll see, darling, I said, patting her hand. We'll see. The party began at 6 p.m. By 7 p.m., the main hall was packed. I circulated through the room, playing my role. I called the mayor governor. I asked a waiter if he was my nephew. I saw Mark watching me from across the room, a glass of scotch in his hand, looking satisfied. He had spent the last 2 days transferring the money on the fake website. He thought he was $2 million richer. He thought he had one. At 8 p.m., Mark clinked a spoon against his glass. The room fell silent. He stood on the grand staircase, looking every inch the lord of the manor. Friends, family, Mark began, his voice booming with false conviviality. Thank you for coming to celebrate our beloved Margaret. You know, it hasn't been an easy year for Mags. We've all seen the changes. But we want her to know that no matter how confused things get, she will always have a home here. A murmur of sympathy rippled through the crowd. It was a masterstroke of passive-aggressive destruction. He was burying me with kindness. In fact, Mark continued, Mags has decided to make a big announcement tonight regarding the future of the estate. Mags, why don't you come up here? He beckoned to me. This was it. He expected me to come up, stammer, look confused, and perhaps announce that I was stepping back from my financial duties, something he had probably coached Arthur to tell me to do. I walked to the staircase. I climbed the steps slowly, holding the railing. I reached the landing and stood next to Mark. He put a heavy arm around my shoulders. Go ahead, Max, he whispered in my ear. Tell them. I looked out at the sea of faces. I saw Lila near the front, looking anxious. I saw Frank Vance, my private investigator, standing in the back near the catering entrance, wearing a tuxedo that didn't fit him, giving me a subtle nod. I took the microphone from Mark. I smiled, and then I dropped the mask. Thank you, Mark, I said. My voice clear, sharp, and commanding. The voice of the woman who had once terrified CEOs across the tri-state area. It is true. I have a very important announcement to make. But first, I think we should listen to a little recording I made. Mark's smile faltered. Max, what are you? Frank, I said into the microphone. Hit it. There is a sound, honey, that is louder than a scream, and heavier than a gavel hitting a judge's bench. It is the sound of 300 people, holding their breath at the exact same moment. When Frank Vance pressed play on his laptop, hooked up to the estate's expensive surround sound system, the ballroom went so quiet. You could hear the ice melting in the champagne buckets. First came the static, then the unmistakable click of a door opening, and finally Mark's voice, amplified to high-definition clarity, booming off the vaulted ceilings. The old bat. I can't liquidate the assets yet. I've been gaslighting her for months, man. Moving her keys, rescheduling her appointments, telling Lila that her mom is getting confused. I watched Mark's face. It didn't just drain of color. It seemed to collapse. He stood frozen next to me on the staircase, his hand still hovering in the air, where he had been holding the microphone seconds before. Below us, the crowd was paralyzed. Lila, standing near the front, brought both hands to her mouth, her eyes wide and brimming with sudden horrified tears. The recording continued mercilessly. Once I have medical POA, we put her in a nice facility. I can pay off the Vegas debt before those guys break my legs. Mark snapped out of his trance. He lunged for the sound system controls on the wall, desperate to stop the hemorrhaging of his reputation. Turn it off, he screamed, his voice cracking. It's fake. It's AI. She's crazy. But before he could reach the panel, Frank Vance stepped out from the shadows, looking like a boulder in a tuxedo. He crossed his arms and simply blocked Mark's path. Mark bounced off him, like a tennis ball hitting a brick wall. I wouldn't do that, kid, Frank grunted, his voice carrying easily over the music of Mark's destruction. I raised the microphone to my lips again. It's not AI, Mark. And I'm not crazy. I'm just observant. Mark spun around to face me, his eyes wild, sweat beading on his forehead. You recorded me. You set me up. I bought a baby monitor. I corrected him calmly. You did the rest yourself. The crowd began to murmur. I saw the mayor whispering to his wife. I saw Mark's business partners slowly backing away, creating a physical distance between themselves and the social fallout. But I wasn't finished. The recording was just the appetizer. I had promised a main course. But ladies and gentlemen, I addressed the room, my son-in-law didn't just plan to lock me away. He also tried to rob me. Mark, tell everyone about the Blue Ledger. Mark looked like he was going to vomit. I don't know what you're talking about. The Cayman account, I said, stepping closer to him. The $2 million you transferred yesterday, using the USB key I gave you, the one you thought was a secure banking key. I was helping you, he shouted, trying to pivot to the victim role. You asked me to move it. You were confused. I wasn't confused, I said, my voice dropping to a steely register that Lila had never heard before. And there was no money, Mark. The website was fake. The account numbers were random digits I made up. But the keylogger on that USB drive, that was very real. It recorded you logging into my legitimate accounts, attempting to bypass security questions, and then authorizing a transfer to a shell company in your name. I pulled a folded piece of paper from my clutch, a printout Frank had handed me 10 minutes ago. This is the log, I said, waving it slightly. Wire fraud, attempted grand larceny, identity theft, and since you used the internet to do it, federal wire fraud. Mark looked at Lila. Lila, baby, please. She's twisting everything. I did it for us. For the baby. Lila stepped forward. The room parted for her. She walked to the bottom of the stairs, looking up at the man she had married. Her face was wet with tears, but her jaw was set in a line I recognized. It was my jawline. For the baby? Lila asked, her voice shaking but audible. You were going to put my mother in an asylum for the baby. You were going to steal her life for the baby. I had to. Mark pleaded. The debts. They were going to kill me, Lila. Then you should have come to me, she whispered. Instead, you made me think my mother was dying. She took a deep breath and pulled her wedding ring off her finger. It clattered onto the marble floor with a sound that seemed louder than the recording. Get out of my house. I live here, Mark snarled, his charm finally evaporating completely, revealing the cornered rat underneath. This is my house. My name is on the deed. Actually, I interjected pleasantly, it's not. The trust documents you signed. You really should have read the fine print, Mark. You have right of residency contingent on marital status. And I think that status just changed. Mark looked ready to charge me. He took a step up the stairs, his hands curled into fists. But before he could make a mistake he couldn't walk away from, the heavy oak doors at the front of the hall swung open. Detective Miller, a man I had known since he was a patrol officer, walked in flanked by two uniformed officers. Frank Vance had timed it to the second. Mark Reynolds, Detective Miller announced, walking through the stunned crowd. We have a warrant for your arrest. Mark slumped against the banister. The fight went out of him all at once. He looked small. He looked young. He looked exactly like what he was, a greedy boy who had played a man's game and lost. As the officers marched him down the stairs, cuffing his hands behind his back, he stopped in front of me. You're a witch, he spat. I smiled, taking a sip of the champagne. A waiter had just handed me. No, Mark. I'm a mother. And you threatened my cub. I watched them drag him out the front door, the flashing red and blue lights from the police cruisers illuminating the shocked faces of the guests. The party was over. But as I looked down at Lila, who was being comforted by her friends, I knew the real work was just beginning. The thing about explosions, honey, is that the boom only lasts a second. It's the cleanup that takes a lifetime. When the police cars faded into the night, and the last guest had whispered their apologies and scurried out the door, the silence that fell over that big house was heavy enough to crush you, but I didn't let it. I had spent 40 years cleaning up financial messes, and I knew that the only way out was through. The next morning wasn't spent crying into a pillow. It was spent in the district attorney's office, a place that smelled of stale coffee and industrial carpet cleaner. Lila sat next to me, pale and quiet, her hands resting protectively on her bump. Frank Vance was there too, looking surprisingly presentable in a sports coat, laying out the evidence like a royal flush. It's not just the wire fraud against you, Mrs. Reynolds, the assistant Dia said, looking at the stack of documents Frank had provided. Your son-in-law was busy. We've found evidence of money laundering through his real estate firm. He was taking cash from illegal gambling operations and filtering it through renovation costs for properties that didn't exist. I nodded, sipping the terrible office coffee. And the loans. Predatory lending. Frank interjected. But since he forged your signature as a guarantor, and we have the handwriting analysis to prove it, the banks are going to have to eat those losses, not you. The house is safe. Lila let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for days. And Mark? What happens to him? The DA looked at her with a mixture of pity and professional detachment. With the federal wire fraud, the identity theft, the money laundering, and the elder abuse enhancements we're tacking on, he's looking at 15 to 20 years. And frankly, considering the people he owes money to in Atlantic City, federal prison is probably the safest place for him. Lila nodded slowly. She didn't ask to see him. She didn't ask to bail him out. The spell was broken. She had seen the monster behind the mask, and she was done feeding it. The hardest part wasn't the legal battle. It was the quiet Tuesday afternoon 3 weeks later. We were in the nursery, The same room where Mark had hatched his plot. I was folding onesies and Lila was sitting in the rocking chair, staring out the window at the guest cottage. I should have known, she whispered. The guilt in her voice was thick and choking. Mom, how could I be so stupid? He was gaslighting you right in front of my face, and I handed him the matches. I put down the tiny yellow sleeper and walked over to her. I knelt beside the chair, ignoring the creak in my knees. Lila, look at me. She turned, her eyes red-rimmed. You were not stupid, I said fiercely. You were in love, and you were trusting. Those are not sins, Lila. Those are gifts. Mark took those gifts and he weaponized them against you. That is his crime, not your failure. A con artist doesn't target people because they are foolish. He targets them because they have something worth stealing. You had a heart. I had a bank account. He wanted both. I almost let him put you away, she sobbed. But you didn't, I said, wiping a tear from her cheek. When the truth came out, you didn't hesitate. You took off that ring and you stood by me. That's what matters. She leaned forward and rested her head on my shoulder, and we stayed like that for a long time. Two women in a quiet house, rebuilding the foundation that a man had tried to crack. 2 months later, on a snowy morning in February, little Arthur was born. He had his grandfather's nose and his mother's eyes. When I held him for the first time, looking down at that scrunched-up, furious little face, I felt a peace settle over me that I hadn't felt in years. Mark was gone, pleaded guilty to avoid a trial, currently sitting in a cell in upstate New York. The debts were settled. The house was ours. I sold the big estate 6 months later. Too many ghosts in the hallways. We moved to a beautiful, manageable brownstone in the city, closer to the parks and the museums. I have my own apartment on the garden level, and Lila and little Arthur have the top 2 floors. It's perfect. I have my privacy, but I can hear the baby laughing through the vents. Sometimes when I'm pushing the stroller through the park, people stop and smile. They see a grandmother and a baby, a harmless, sweet image. They see an old woman with white hair and sensible shoes. They have no idea that this old woman took down a criminal enterprise with a baby monitor and a fake ledger. And that, my darlings, is exactly how I like it. Because if there is one thing I have learned, it is this. Let them underestimate you. Let them think you are past your prime. Let them think you are invisible. Because invisibility is a superpower. You can see everything when no one is watching you. And when the wolves come knocking at your door, thinking they've found an easy meal, well, you just make sure you're the one who sets the table. This is Mary signing off. Keep your eyes open, keep your record straight, and never ever let them see you coming.